joining us now in the studio is the Shadow Work and Pension Secretary, Debbie Abrahams.
Good morning, Sophie.
Hello, nice to see you.
And lovely to see you too.
I thought I'd start off by talking to you about this public sector pay rise, about austerity, because I've been filming in a school in Hackney this week. We'll show the report a bit later on in the show, but they're very worried about funding and about their own pay. Is it time, do you think, to give public sector workers a real terms pay rise?
We do. In fact, we have committed to that. We know that from analysis from the TUC, for example, public sector pay workers by 2020 will have pay rates at 2004 levels. They've already lost £1,000 in real terms of wages. By 2020, it's going to be £3,000. So that's our nurses, our teachers, our firefighters and police officers. And we believe it's not right. There's a moral case as well as an economical case as well for giving them a pay rise.
Talking about the economics, the Labour Party manifesto pledges £4 billion a year for this.
Yes.
Now, according to the IFS, if you were going to give public sector pay rises anything like something in line with what the private sector are receiving, then actually, by the end of the Parliament, it would cost £10 billion a year. So there's a bit of a disparity here. Where's that money going to come from?
Well, first of all, we used OBR figures just in the same ways that the IFS did. The IFS
so why
model,
have you come up with different?
Well, the IFS model used different assumptions around it. So, for example, it included employers' national insurance. It also included different aspects around pensions. So, as we know, forecast models are notoriously difficult to be predictive, but that's the basis for the difference. And we make sure...
Well, it's quite a big difference, though, isn't it?
It is.
Nearly £6 billion a year.
But as I say, it was based on different assumptions. So we will look at future models to make sure that we address the sort of anomalies that you've highlighted there.
Inflation is high, 3%. If we kind of go back to that discrepancy between Labour's figures, which you say are based on different assumptions, and the IFS figures, who in many ways are the kind of independent think tank on this, lots of people will be saying it's very easy to rail against the government from opposition, but actually your sums don't add up.
Well, again, I disagree with that. But if we look more broadly at this year round austerity, we know from the IMF, we know from Nobel economists such as Paul Krugman and Joseph Stiglitz, they have shown that austerity, including a public sector pay gap, just isn't working. It actually is stifling the economy. So again, getting back to the moral imperative that it is right that we give our public sector workers a pay rise, but it also makes economical sense. Think about the additional costs.
The moral imperative is one thing, but the specifics are another, aren't
they? Well, then let me get on. Is it right that, for example, in terms of the banks for nurses that are being paid millions of pounds. Similarly with teachers, the impact that is having on the overall salary costs for teachers and nurses. Then if we look at some of the impacts of the public sector pay gap, I was contacted by a secondary school teacher in Sussex who is going to be made homeless. Her service charge has gone up in her home. She can't afford it. So she's a lone parent with her son, 2-bedroom flat. She's having to sell that to go into the private sector. The impact potentially on social security costs.
It doesn't make sense. These difficult cases, but to really do right by them, you've got to talk about figures, haven't you?
It's up and down the country, Sophie. So we know, for example, of a teacher wanting to buy a house, an average house in London.
Would about how it's funded, though, isn't it?
Can I just make these points? I think it's really important to make these. To save up to buy a home, they'd have to be saving for 71 years to get a 63% deposit for a home. Again, teachers are leaving in their drove. We're relying on bank staff and additional cost in teaching costs. It just doesn't make economic sense.
So if you feel so passionately about it, why aren't you putting more money into it?
We believe that we've costed in an effective way. I've said right at the beginning that the models that we used were different, and that explains the discrepancy between the IFS figure and the figure that we came up to. If we used similar models, I would hazard a guess that they'd come up with similar results.
Well, 1% increase to public sector pay costs around £1.8 billion a year. Inflation's at 3%. So to do the maths, 4 billion isn't going to cut it, is it?
We said that we would defer to pay review bodies who would set the level that we would be considering if we were in government.
But it doesn't add up. The money doesn't add up, does it?
Again, I get back to the points that I've made before. We used one model, the IFS used another. We believe that we can satisfy the needs for both the public sector pay rise and for doing the right thing.
OK, well, let's move on to your own brief, the benefits, because this is something else I've been slightly wrestling to try and understand exactly where your party is at on benefits. So we can go kind of slow and steady through some of this, if that's OK. And we can have a look now at some of the biggest cuts that are being planned over the next Parliament. So you can see here the freeze on working age benefits, that would save about £3.6 billion a year. Cuts to universal credit, saving around £3.2 billion. The limit on benefits for 2 children, around £2 billion. So that is a total of £8.8 billion a year. Now, look at your party's spending plans in the manifesto. You've only pledged £2 billion to reverse all that. So are you happy to keep 80% of the government's cuts to benefits?
No, what we said is that we would spend £4 billion a year on cuts, on reversing cuts to the employment support allowance, which are affecting the work-related activity group, affecting 500,000 people there, 300,000 with mental health conditions, the PIP regulations that were introduced without any debate, without any vote, affecting 166,000 people with mental health conditions. We'd also be making sure that people under 21 who've been excluded from the housing market in terms of housing support, as well as the 2-child limit, which you mentioned there. But on top of that, we allowed for in-year costs of £2 billion to look at how we could make...
On top of the £4 billion, because in your manifesto it says, if I'm right...
No, just a second. So what I said was I gave you the examples. I gave the examples of the specific cuts that we would reverse, and then I said on top of those, we would reform and transform universal credit. Within that, looking at a freeze, reversing the freeze, which is we estimate about 900 million a year, as well as in terms of the cap that High Court judge found illegal for lone parents with children under 2.
So this is where my confusion is. The £2 billion...
I don't know your sources, these are the sources again.
This is the on the government figures. The sources that I'm talking about is from your manifesto. £2 billion on the specifics that you've laid out there. £2 billion to deal with remaining cuts, changes to universal credit. But £2 billion doesn't equate to £8.8 billion.
£4 billion overall, as
yes,
I say,
£2 billion,
£2 billion
plus £2 billion.
Specifically for universal credit. We're reforming that, for also looking at the freeze. So we recognise the complexity and the difficulty about reforming the market. We know, again, from work from the Citizens Advice Bureau that I'm sure you're going to come up onto, that was published this week, Sophie, that was saying it's just not fit for purpose. It's driving people into homelessness. It's driving them into food banks. It's leaving people in destitution. So we were intending to reform our social security system so it's fit for a 21st century workplace. We know that people are going into and out of work, the precarious work situation that 10 million people find themselves in. And our social security system just isn't fit for purpose. We know, again, from the High Court judge, it's saying it's pushing children into poverty. So we are doing this in the context of also making sure that we have a living wage, a real living wage of £10 an hour. We are going to be transforming our housing market. Housing costs are significant, the second biggest cost after the state pension.
So I just want to come back to the specifics here, because you say that the system isn't fit for purpose. So why is it then that it seems that you are accepting 80% of the cuts? Because, again, the £2 billion that you've reserved for looking at universal credit just doesn't equate to the £8.8 billion.
Well, I'd love to know how you've come up with those figures, to be honest, Sophie, because we did a quite
this is
detailed
the Resolution
analysis.
Foundation's analysis of the government's figures.
Oh, well, I'm grateful for that source, but ours differs slightly. We want to make sure that we do transform them, but it's in the context, as as well of what else we will do around the living wage, around reforming the housing market, about making sure that we address the real issues around a stagnating economy, which tends to only be supporting London and the South East.
And do you really think £2 billion is enough to do all that?
2 billion is what we have set by a year at the moment around universal credit specifically and the freeze.
So do you think it's enough to do all that?
I think that's going to make a significant inroads. As I say, we estimate, again using the government figures, so appreciate models do vary, and I've put all the caveats around that, but we estimate that the 900 million a year will be around the freeze, and around 150 million around the supporting the reversal of the lower cap.
Part of me can't help wondering, to be quite cynical about this, is that you didn't lay out the total cost of what it would mean to do all you want with a benefit system in your manifesto because you knew how expensive it would be. And also because you didn't need to, because everyone trusts Jeremy Corbyn's credentials when it comes to benefits. Was it not in the manifesto deliberately because you knew that it would be too expensive, or was it just an oversight?
Definitely not an oversight. I've been working very hard, and as you rightly say, so has Jeremy and John McDonnell, to be fair, absolutely.
So you deliberately left it out then?
Not deliberately left. We felt that we could make significant inroads by looking at this in the round. It's not just about social security.
You're keeping 80% of the cuts.
No, Sophie, what I'm saying is that we're looking in the context of what we're doing, for example, around self-employment, around our Workplace 2020 agenda. So I'm working very hard across interdepartmental groups with Rebecca Long-Bailey, for example, around what this means of transforming our social security system so that it's fit for a new workplace of the 21st century. And that includes, as I say, again, making sure that people on the lowest pay have a decent rate for a decent day's work.
OK, now before you go, I'm quite interested to get your views on deselections. After the election, of course, Jeremy Corbyn is riding high. He's backed by the membership, but there's lots of talk about unruly colleagues, perhaps people who haven't always been loyal in the past, being up for reselection in their own constituencies. What would you say to people calling for
that? First of all, I think the election was a huge result for us, a really positive result, and it showed what we can do when we all pull together, when we all work for a single objective, which is about making sure that we have a fairer Britain. We know we don't have a fairer Britain, and there are so many people who are being left on the margins, disabled people in low pay.
Reselections, what's your...
My point is that we all need to come together. I haven't heard that. It hasn't been said in any conversations that I have been party to. We have a very talented group of MPs, including some that have been there for a while, including those that have just come on board. We all need to work together and to deliver. We could have an election in a few months, and we need to be pulling together to make sure that we can deliver for the country and for the people that have been marginalised and excluded for much, much too long.
OK, Debbie Abrahams, thank you very much for being on the show.
Thank you.